Good evening. Tonight our story is the rise and fall of the Nazi war machine. We aren't going to focus on loud cinematic battles. Instead, we are going to trace the slow, methodical breakdown of an empire that was mathematically doomed from the start. Before we begin, take a moment to let go of the day. Lower the brightness on your screen, pull up the blankets, and let these historical details serve as your white noise. Close your eyes, and let's begin. There is a fundamental misunderstanding about how the First World War actually ended for Germany. Pop history treats the Treaty of Versailles like a harsh diplomatic agreement. That is a myth. It was an impossible mathematical equation designed to systematically bankrupt a nation. When the ink dried in 1919, the victorious Allies demanded an astronomical sum in reparations. 132 billion gold marks. That number is so large, it loses all practical meaning. The debt itself wasn't even the primary failure point. The Allies simultaneously confiscated the exact physical mechanisms Germany needed to generate that wealth. They stripped away the coal-rich Saar Basin. They seized the iron ore deposits in Alsace-Lorraine. They dismantled the German merchant fleet and confiscated the patents of the chemical industry. You cannot demand a factory meet a record-breaking production quota immediately after you unbolt the heavy machinery and steal the generators. The math was broken from day one. By 1923, the inevitable happened. The Weimar Republic defaulted on its reparation payments. In response, the French and Belgian armies physically occupied the Ruhr Valley, the industrial heartland of Germany. They decided to just mine the coal and seize the steel themselves. The German government ordered its industrial workers to go on strike and passively resist the occupation. The state still had to pay those striking workers to keep them from starving. The Weimar bureaucracy had zero revenue coming in. They bypassed economics entirely and resorted to pure mechanical output. They turned on the printing presses. This is where the financial immune system of the entire country collapsed. Hyperinflation is usually taught as a neat economic concept where prices go up. The physical reality of hyperinflation is a biological nightmare. Money completely lost its function as a reliable store of value. It reverted to being just cheap paper. The printing presses ran 24 hours a day, churning out banknotes with increasingly absurd denominations. A single loaf of bread went from costing a quarter of a mark to costing 200 billion marks in the span of a few months. The velocity of the currency failure was so extreme that it warped daily life. Factory workers demanded to be paid twice a day. When the morning whistle blew, their wives would literally run to the factory gates, grab bundles of cash, and sprint to the bakeries to buy food before the exchange rate shifted at noon. If you ordered a cup of coffee at a cafe, the price would often double by the time you finished drinking it. People brought wheelbarrows full of cash to the market. Thieves would dump the money in the street just to steal the wooden wheelbarrow. It had more intrinsic value. The hyperinflation eventually stabilized, but the psychological damage was permanent. The middle class was mathematically deleted. Generational wealth, life savings, pensions, and war bonds were reduced to the value of scrap paper overnight. A society stripped of its financial baseline loses all trust in its institutions. Then came the Dawes Plan in 1924. The American financial sector stepped in to act as a massive artificial band-aid. Wall Street banks began pumping billions of dollars in high-interest loans directly into the German economy. They used American capital to pay the European reparations. The Europeans then used that exact capital to pay back their own American war debts. It was a closed, highly fragile loop of international credit. The late 1920s in Berlin are often romanticized as a golden age of cabaret, art, and recovery. From a systems perspective, it was a total hallucination. The entire German infrastructure was running on leased time and foreign liquidity. The chassis was incredibly fragile. In October 1929, the American stock market crashed. The margin calls hit. American banks desperately needed cash, so they recalled all their European loans. The foreign capital keeping the Weimar Republic alive evaporated in a matter of days. The German economy didn't just recede, it physically stopped. Factories shut their doors, the supply chains froze. Almost overnight, 6 million German workers were thrown out on the street. When a bureaucratic system cannot guarantee basic caloric intake for its population, the biological hardware radicalizes. Millions of starving, humiliated people looked at the democratic parliament in Berlin and saw nothing but gridlock, weakness, and failure. Democracy became completely irrelevant to a man who couldn't feed his children. The people didn't want parliamentary procedure anymore. They wanted a megaphone. They wanted someone to assign blame, smash the broken system, and promise them a future. The vacuum was perfectly engineered. Adolf Hitler simply walked into the void with a loudspeaker. There is a cinematic myth about how the Third Reich started. People picture a violent, overwhelming coup. Millions of fanatical stormtroopers kicking down the doors of the Capitol and physically dragging the Weimar Republic into the street. That never happened. Democracy wasn't assassinated in Germany. It committed constitutional suicide in a quiet room, entirely legally. If you want to understand 1933, you have to look at the sheer arrogance of the conservative establishment. By the early 30s, the German parliament was completely paralyzed by the Depression. Nobody could form a working coalition. So the president, an aging World War I hero named Paul von Hindenburg, just started ruling by emergency decree. The Weimar Constitution had a fatal flaw built right into its foundation. Article 48. It allowed the president to bypass parliament entirely in times of crisis. They had normalized a legal dictatorship years before Hitler ever sat in the chancellor's chair. The old Prussian aristocrats running the government despised the Nazis. They viewed them as vulgar, uneducated street thugs, but they were absolutely terrified of the communists. The traditional elites needed a populist mascot, somebody who could yell at the crowds, rally the working class, and physically smash the labor unions. The aristocrats figured they could just quietly pull the strings from the back room. Franz von Papen engineered the deal. He was a conservative politician with an ego completely detached from reality. He convinced Hindenburg to make Hitler chancellor in January 1933, stacking the cabinet with his own conservative allies and leaving only 2 minor posts for the Nazis. He famously bragged to his friends that within 2 months, they would have pushed Hitler so far into a corner that he'd squeak. It remains one of the most catastrophic political miscalculations in human history. They thought they were hiring a guard dog. They didn't realize the dog was going to eat the house. But politicians don't build war machines. Industrialists do. This is the piece of the puzzle that usually gets scrubbed from the corporate histories. On February 20th, 1933, a few weeks after Hitler became chancellor, a secret meeting took place at Hermann Göring's residence. The guest list was a who's who of German corporate power. Gustav Krupp was there, the executives of IG Farben, the titans of coal and steel. Hitler walked into the room and explicitly promised to eliminate the trade unions, crush the communist threat, and completely rearm the nation. Rearmament meant massive, unprecedented government contracts. The industrialists didn't necessarily care about the virulent anti-Semitism or the racial ideology. They cared about profit margins and an obedient workforce. Hjalmar Schacht, the financial architect of the regime, passed a hat around the room. In a single evening, the German corporate establishment handed the Nazi Party 3 million marks to fund their final election campaign. They essentially bought the regime. Hitler didn't even have to stage a revolution. A month into his chancellorship, the Reichstag building caught fire. An unemployed Dutch communist was caught at the scene. Whether he acted alone or the Nazis helped him is completely irrelevant to the systems of power. The fire provided the excuse. Within 24 hours, the bureaucratic machinery of the state drafted the Reichstag fire decree. It suspended freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to assembly. Warrants were no longer required for searches. The police could hold anyone indefinitely without charging them. Hindenburg signed it without a second thought. Just like that, the entire legal immune system of the Weimar Republic shut down. A month later, they put the final nail in the coffin. The Enabling Act. This was a constitutional amendment legally allowing the chancellor to pass any law he wanted without parliament. To pass it, Hitler actually needed a 2/3 majority, and the Nazis didn't have the votes. So they weaponized the physical environment. Because the Reichstag was a burned-out shell, the parliament met in the Kroll Opera House. When the elected officials arrived, the building was surrounded by the SS. Inside the chamber, armed SA paramilitaries lined the aisles. They literally stood over the politicians, glaring at them, casually slapping truncheons against their palms. The communist delegates weren't even there. They had already been thrown into the first concentration camps. The Social Democrats bravely voted against it, knowing they were marking themselves for death. The Catholic Center Party folded. They traded their votes for vague promises about protecting the church. The parliament legally voted itself out of existence. The political opposition was gone. But Hitler still had one massive systemic vulnerability: the traditional military. The Reichswehr was the actual professional army of Germany. The aristocratic generals absolutely hated the SA, Hitler's personal paramilitary force. By 1934, the SA had millions of members. They were a massive, unruly mob of street fighters demanding to replace the professional army. The generals went to Hitler and delivered an ultimatum. If he didn't bring his street thugs to heel, the military would step in and launch a real coup. Hitler looked at the board. He needed the professional military to build the tanks and planes that Krupp and IG Farben were about to manufacture. The street fighters had outlived their usefulness. Over the course of 3 days in the summer of 1934, the night of the long knives, the SS rounded up the entire leadership of the SA. They dragged Ernst Röhm, the head of the organization and one of Hitler's oldest friends, into a prison cell and shot him point blank. They used the chaos to settle old scores, murdering hundreds of political rivals, including Franz von Pappen's own staff. The military leadership watched the massacre and applauded. They thought Hitler had finally acted like a statesman by restoring order. 2 months later, Hindenburg finally died. Hitler instantly merged the offices of President and Chancellor into one supreme title: Führer. But the real systemic lock happened inside the military. The Minister of Defense, a completely compliant general named Werner von Blomberg, ripped up the old constitutional oath. He made the entire armed forces swear a new, unconditional oath of personal, biological obedience directly to Adolf Hitler. The bureaucratic suicide was complete. The state was secured, funded by the industrial elite, and guarded by a totally subservient military. Now they could focus entirely on building the machine. The Treaty of Versailles accidentally created the exact conditions required for a military systems hack. By restricting the German army to a mere 100,000 men and stripping them of heavy artillery and tanks, the Allies effectively banned the 19th century model of warfare. The German high command could no longer rely on a massive, slow-moving wall of conscripts. They were forced to cultivate a hyper-concentrated management class. The Reichswehr became an army of theoretical engineers obsessed with mobility. They looked at the demographic and economic data of the 1920s. Germany was mathematically incapable of fighting another static war of attrition. They lacked the domestic oil, the rubber, and the deep financial reserves of the British Empire or the United States. To survive a future conflict, the military apparatus had to be completely reimagined. They needed a system capable of delivering localized, catastrophic velocity. They engineered a doctrine based entirely on kinetic energy. Pop history obsesses over the physical armor of the early German panzer divisions. Documentaries fetishize the tracks and the caliber of the main guns. The steel is largely irrelevant. The actual weapon that broke Europe was the two-way radio. Look at the hardware comparison. In the late 1930s, the French and British militaries possessed tanks vastly superior in armor plating and firepower. The French Char B-1 was a rolling fortress. The French military bureaucracy viewed the tanks strictly as an infantry support vehicle. They deployed them in small, isolated packets. The French tank commander was forced into an impossible physical bottleneck. He had to command his vehicle, load the main gun, and aim the weapon simultaneously. To communicate with other tanks, he had to open the top hatch in the middle of a firefight and wave colored signal flags. It was a complete cognitive overload, resulting in immediate tactical paralysis. The early German tanks, the Panzer I and II, were essentially unarmored tin cans armed with machine guns. They were practically disposable. Every single German tank was equipped with a compact radio receiver. Every command tank possessed a transmitter. The doctrine fundamentally shifted from massed firepower to networked communication. Heinz Guderian and the architects of the Armored Corps realized a tank without a radio is just a deaf steel box. A division of tanks networked together by radio frequencies operates as a synchronized kinetic swarm. The strategy, known as the Schwerpunkt, or focal point, relied on concentrating this networked armor into a single, overwhelming spearhead. The objective was to pierce a narrow hole in the front line, ignore the flanks entirely, and drive relentlessly into the enemy's rear echelon. This required unprecedented bandwidth and security. The network was heavily augmented by the Enigma machine. We usually associate Enigma with submarines and code breakers at Bletchley Park. Its primary function was actually tactical field coordination. By placing Enigma machines in mobile command half-tracks directly behind the Panzer spearheads, the German generals could transmit encrypted, highly complex logistical adjustments in real time. A divisional commander could redirect 1,000 vehicles across a 50-mile front in a matter of minutes without the enemy intercepting the coordinates. The Panzer Division operated like a shark. It had to keep moving to oxygenate its own supply lines. The French and British commands were entirely unprepared for a war waged at the speed of an electromagnetic frequency. The French Supreme Commander, Maurice Gamelin, orchestrated the defense of Europe from a chateau in Vincennes. He intentionally refused to install a radio network or even a telephone in his headquarters. He believed radio traffic was an intellectual distraction. He demanded a quiet environment to think. This decision initiated a fatal mathematical discrepancy. The French army was still drafting written orders on paper and sending them via motorcycle couriers. Consider the sheer physical friction of this system. A French frontline unit spots a German armored column. They write a report. A courier gets on a motorcycle and attempts to navigate roads completely choked with terrified civilian refugees. It takes him 3 hours to reach the regional headquarters. The general reads the report, drafts a counterattack order, and hands it to another courier. By the time that physical piece of paper reaches a French tank battalion 6 hours later, the German Panzer Division has already driven another 100 miles. The French army was mathematically incapable of fighting the German armor in real time. They were effectively fighting ghosts. The command loop was hopelessly shattered. The illusion of the Blitzkrieg was that the tanks were doing the killing. The tanks were simply the physical delivery mechanism for the radios. The German armored columns completely stripped away traditional, slow-moving heavy artillery. They didn't need it. The radios allowed specialized forward air controllers riding in the command tanks to call in Stuka dive bombers directly onto enemy strongpoints. The Stuka functioned as flying artillery tethered to the Panzer Division by an invisible electromagnetic leash. It was a completely decentralized execution of a central plan. By overrunning the opposing communication hubs, supply depots, and command tents, the German armor isolated the enemy infantry. The opposing biological hardware was left intact but completely paralyzed, unable to receive orders or ammunition. The kinetic network bypassed the physical fight entirely. It initiated an immediate administrative collapse. The French army was mathematically incapable of fighting the German armor in real time. They were effectively fighting ghosts. The command loop was hopelessly shattered. The illusion of the Blitzkrieg was that the tanks were doing the killing. The tanks were simply the physical delivery mechanism for the radios. The German armored columns completely stripped away traditional, slow-moving heavy artillery. They didn't need it. The radios allowed specialized forward air controllers riding in the command tanks to call in Stuka dive bombers directly onto enemy strongpoints. The Stuka functioned as flying artillery tethered to the Panzer Division by an invisible electromagnetic leash. It was a completely decentralized execution of a central plan. By overrunning the opposing communication hubs, supply depots, and command tents, the German armor isolated the enemy infantry. The opposing biological hardware was left intact but completely paralyzed, unable to receive orders or ammunition. The kinetic network bypassed the physical fight entirely. It initiated an immediate administrative collapse. The physical reality of the Wehrmacht was deliberately hidden from the cameras. The military was fundamentally divided into two completely different armies. The elite, Kinetic spearhead was fully mechanized. The vast, overwhelming majority of the German infantry operated on 19th century logistics. They marched on foot. They relied on hundreds of thousands of draft horses to pull their artillery and supply wagons. The biological math of a horse-drawn army is terrifying. A single draft horse requires roughly 20 pounds of fodder and oats every single day just to maintain its pulling capacity. Multiply that by 500,000 animals. The logistical tail required to feed the horses was exponentially larger than the supply lines required to fuel the tanks. You cannot simply forage for that amount of biomass in the Polish countryside during a rapid advance. The animals would starve. The national rail network was entirely consumed with shipping hay and oats to the front lines. The mechanized vanguard was operating at 50 miles an hour. The biological tail was moving at the speed of a Roman legion, burning a massive percentage of the military's rail capacity just to keep its transportation alive. The Polish army recognized these massive logistical gaps. The story of Polish cavalry charging German tanks with lances is a fabricated myth invented by German propagandists and later repeated by lazy historians. The Polish military actually possessed excellent anti-tank rifles and their own armored units. During the Battle of the Bzura, Polish forces executed a massive, coordinated counter-offensive that completely severed the German 30th Infantry Division. The High Command briefly panicked. The kinetic network was highly susceptible to being cut off from its biological tail. The infantry could not keep up with the armor. The radios were useless when the command half-track batteries died. When the campaign ended a month later, the German quartermasters and logistics officers panicked. They compiled massive, data-driven reports detailing the catastrophic caloric burn rate of the fuel reserves and the terrifying fragility of the supply chain. They tracked the thousands of mechanical failures. They warned the High Command that the current logistical infrastructure could not support a prolonged campaign against a major industrial power like France or Britain. This is where the terminal bureaucratic arrogance of the Nazi state truly took root. Hitler and the senior leadership looked at the conquered map of Poland and completely dismissed the statistical anomalies. They ignored the quartermasters. They confused a successful prototype with a perfected system. The High Command assumed that because the machine had violently stumbled across the finish line in Warsaw, the underlying mathematics of their supply chain were inherently sound. They completely rejected the data. They hard-coded their logistical oversights into the foundation of the military. They took a chaotic, top-heavy, mathematically unsound system, loaded it with untested biological hardware, and immediately pointed it toward the French border. Pop history treats the fall of France like a foregone conclusion. The whole cheese-eating surrender monkey myth, it is complete garbage. If you look at the raw data in May 1940, the French military was a terrifying obstacle. They had more men, they had better artillery, they had more tanks, and their tanks were significantly better. The French Char B-1 heavy tank could literally park in an open field and just let German anti-tank rounds bounce off its hull all afternoon. The German High Command was genuinely terrified of the French. They expected millions of casualties. They expected a repeat of the absolute meat grinder at Verdun. So they didn't attack the wall. They went through the woods. The Manstein Plan pushed the armored spearhead through the Ardennes forest. The Allies thought the terrain was impassable for heavy armor. Honestly, half the German general staff agreed with them. If you pull the logistical logs from that movement, it is a masterclass in reckless stupidity. The Wehrmacht shoved tens of thousands of mechanized vehicles into narrow, unpaved logging roads. It created a bumper-to-bumper traffic jam that stretched 150 miles backward, deep into Germany. Think about the vulnerability there. If the French or British had just sent a few squadrons of heavy bombers to carpet bomb that forest canopy, the Second World War in the West would have ended right there in a burning traffic jam. Allied reconnaissance pilots actually flew over the forest, took photos of the massive armored column, and handed them to the High Command. The French leadership basically looked at the photos and said, "No, that's impossible." They ignored hard data because it conflicted with their pre-existing doctrine. That is exactly how you lose a sovereign nation. But getting through the trees was only half the problem. They hit the Meuse River at Sedan. Tanks do not swim. The propaganda reels show panzers rolling through French villages, but they skip the fact that the spearhead completely stalled at the riverbank. This wasn't a mechanized victory. It was a brutal, desperate infantry assault. German combat engineers had to drag inflatable boats and pontoon bridges through the mud under heavy French artillery fire. They took massive casualties just to build a temporary physical bridge so the Krupp steel could finally cross. Once they cross the river, the kinetic paralysis goes into overdrive. This is where you have to look at the communication systems. The commander of the French armed forces, General Maurice Gamelin, ran his entire war from a medieval castle outside Paris, the Château de Vincennes. He didn't have a single radio in his headquarters. He didn't trust them. He wanted to rely on telephone lines and motorcycle dispatch riders, just like in 1914. Meanwhile, every single German tank has a two-way radio. Once the panzers break out, the old Prussian generals back in Berlin completely lose control of their own army. Panzer commanders like Guderian and Rommel just keep driving. The High Command is screaming over the radio network for them to halt, terrified that the Allies are going to launch a massive counterattack and sever their exposed flanks. Rommel famously disconnected his radio receiver so he could pretend he didn't hear the halt order. It is total court-martial level insubordination. It completely shattered the French command structure. By the time a French frontline officer realized a panzer division had broken through, he had to physically find a working telephone line. He calls Paris. Paris looks at a map from yesterday. Paris drafts a counterattack order. The order goes to a guy on a motorcycle. By the time that rider actually finds the frontline unit, the German tank division is 40 miles closer to the English Channel. You had 2 million armed men sitting in the concrete bunkers of the Maginot Line, staring out at empty fields, while the enemy was already drinking coffee behind them in Paris. But the speed was a facade. We always talk about the famous halt order outside Dunkirk as Hitler's massive strategic blunder. The idea that he just let the British army escape. Look at the maintenance logs. The German High Command didn't halt outside Dunkirk as a political favor. They halted because the machine was physically tearing itself to pieces. The tank treads were snapping. The engines were burning oil. They had outrun their supply lines by days, and the mechanics desperately needed 48 hours just to bolt the armored divisions back together. And it wasn't just the steel breaking down. You cannot run an armored division to the English Channel in a week without breaking the men inside. The operational plans demanded continuous advance. They couldn't afford to stop and sleep. But the officers on the ground were looking at their drivers, kids in their early 20s who were literally passing out with their hands on the steering levers. They were hallucinating obstacles in the road. They were misidentifying friendly units because their optic nerves were completely shot from sleep deprivation. The military had engineered a tactical doctrine that required the human nervous system to stay awake and combat effective for 4 days straight. The fundamental flaw of the kinetic network was the human operator. A machine can run indefinitely if supplied with adequate fuel, lubricants, and spare parts. The biological hardware cannot. The human nervous system requires a mandatory daily shutdown period to clear metabolic waste from the brain. In a military doctrine based entirely on continuous, uninterrupted velocity, the human need for sleep is a massive mathematical liability. The French High Command factored this biological requirement directly into their defensive calculations. They assumed that even if the German armor broke through the border lines, the panzer divisions would be forced to halt at nightfall to rest their crews and perform basic vehicle maintenance. The French command loop operated under the strict assumption of a daily operational pause. They believed they would always have the night to draft new orders, reposition their artillery, and counterattack at dawn. The German military bureaucracy simply deleted the operational pause. The solution was a massive, state-sponsored pharmaceutical hack. In 1938, a Berlin-based pharmaceutical company called Temmler-Werk patented a new chemical compound synthesized from ephedrine. They called it Pervitin. It was highly concentrated, over-the-counter methamphetamine. Dr. Otto Rank, the director of the Institute for General and Defense Physiology at the Military Medical Academy, recognized the drug's logistical potential. He conducted rigorous clinical trials on young medical officers, recording their heart rates, motor skills, and cognitive functions after 36 hours of induced insomnia. Rank was entirely uninterested in the drug's euphoric side effects. He viewed Pervitin strictly as an operational tool to override the fatigue limits of the biological hardware. He calculated that chemically eliminating the need for sleep would effectively double the kinetic output of a panzer division. The tanks could drive 24 hours a day. During the invasion of France in May 1940, the theoretical hack was deployed on an industrial scale. The High Command ordered 35 million Pervitin tablets. They bypassed the standard medical supply chains and distributed the drug directly to the quartermasters of the armored spearheads. The medical instructions were blunt and dangerously simplistic. Take 1 pill every 12 hours to maintain wakefulness. For the troops who disliked swallowing pills, the factories produced Panzer Schokolade, tank chocolate, which was heavily laced with the active methamphetamine compound. The crossing of the Ardennes forest is routinely celebrated by military historians as a masterstroke of audacity. Heinz Guderian pushed thousands of tanks and support vehicles through a dense, mountainous traffic jam that stretched for 100 miles along narrow dirt roads. The logistical reality is that the entire maneuver was chemically subsidized. Tank drivers navigated the treacherous terrain continuously for 3 straight days and nights without a single hour of sleep. They swallowed methamphetamines exactly like combat rations. This created an unprecedented physiological state on the battlefield. The German vanguard was entirely sleep-deprived and operating on an artificial, hyper-elevated dopamine loop. The drug suppressed their appetite, completely masked their physical exhaustion, and induced a state of aggressive, psychotic confidence. The chemical altered their basic risk assessment. The soldiers lost their natural human hesitation in the face of enemy fire. When these units smashed into the French and British lines, the psychological impact was devastating. The Allied soldiers were confronting an enemy operating completely outside the parameters of human biology. The German columns simply never stopped. They attacked at noon, they maneuvered at midnight, and they attacked again at dawn. The French generals looked at the tactical map and watched their defensive lines disintegrate at a speed that mathematically made no sense. They assumed they were facing a superhuman, ideologically fanatical army. They were actually facing a highly mechanized vanguard experiencing a collective pharmaceutical fever dream. The initial success of the Blitzkrieg was an illusion sustained by millions of doses of crystal meth. The High Command completely ignored the biological debt. You cannot permanently hack the central nervous system. Pervitin actively masks the physiological need for sleep and borrows operational energy from the future at a catastrophic physiological interest rate. When the campaign in France finally concluded, the armored divisions experienced a massive collective physiological crash. Medical officers began reporting rampant chemical addiction, sudden heart failure, and severe neurological degradation among the elite tank crews. Men were falling asleep on duty and suffering intense depressive episodes. Instead of halting the program, the military bureaucracy doubled down. The civilian health minister attempted to restrict public access to the drug, but the army integrated it directly into their core supply chain. They treated methamphetamine as a fundamental logistical necessity, completely on par with diesel fuel and artillery shells. They hard-coded a chemical dependency into the foundation of their armed forces. The bureaucracy loaded a massive pharmaceutical time bomb into the machine, setting the stage for the total biological collapse in the Russian snow a year later. By late 1940, the machine encountered its first absolute physical boundary: water. The English Channel stripped the German army of its defining asset, the Panzer Division. To force Britain out of the war, Hermann Göring promised to shatter their industrial capacity from the air. The resulting Battle of Britain was a catastrophic systemic failure. The Luftwaffe was built to act as flying artillery for tanks. It was an entirely tactical air force. Göring sent short-range dive bombers and medium bombers across the Channel to fight a long-range strategic war. The planes physically lacked the fuel capacity to loiter over London. Their payload was mathematically insufficient to level modern British factories. British Fighter Command, guided by a newly integrated radar network, simply calculated the intercept trajectories and shredded the bomber wings. The Third Reich was fundamentally incapable of power projection without a land bridge. The High Command needed to move the war back to the continent, back to the dirt. In June 1941, they launched Operation Barbarossa. 3 million men crossed the Soviet border. The scale of the invasion was historically unprecedented. The logistics were entirely delusional. The German planners looked at a map of Russia and saw geography. They should have seen a mathematical abyss. Blitzkrieg relied entirely on established European infrastructure. The French and Belgian road networks were paved. The distances between supply depots were short and easily managed. The Soviet Union was a primitive, unpaved ocean spanning thousands of miles. A single panzer division requires roughly 300 tons of supplies every single day just to exist. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and food. Multiply that by the entire invading force. The daily logistical requirement was a mountain of steel and calories that had to be physically moved across a void. As soon as the armored spearheads pushed past the border, the friction on the machinery skyrocketed. A tank driving on a paved French highway consumes a predictable amount of diesel. That same tank driving through the deep, rutted dirt of the Russian steppe burns fuel at twice the calculated rate. Tank engines choked on the heavy dust. Supply trucks snapped their axles in the primitive roads and had to be abandoned. The generals assumed they could simply utilize the massive Russian railway system to move their fuel and ammunition forward. They completely ignored a fundamental piece of engineering data. The Soviet Union used a wider track gauge than the rest of Europe. None of the German supply trains actually fit on the Russian tracks. The logistical spine of the entire invasion snapped on day one. The quartermasters had to frantically build specialized transfer stations at the border. Thousands of tons of supplies had to be manually unloaded from German trains, carried across the dirt by hand, and reloaded onto the few captured Soviet trains they managed to secure. The Deutsche Reichsbahn quickly realized these transfer stations were a bottleneck the army couldn't survive. They were forced to actually rip up thousands of miles of Russian tracks and physically relay them to the narrower German gauge, all while being constantly harassed by Soviet partisans. The friction was catastrophic. The armored spearheads raced hundreds of miles ahead, completely severing themselves from their own paralyzed supply lines. To bridge the widening gap, the highly mechanized, futuristic German army resorted to a 19th century solution. They drafted over 600,000 horses. When the autumn rains hit in October, the unpaved roads turned into a gelatinous swamp called the Rasputitsa. The wheeled Opel Blitz supply trucks sank to their engine blocks and died. The entire logistical burden fell on the animals. The horses began starving to death in the mud. They desperately ate the thatched roofs off peasant cottages just to survive. The forward momentum of the invasion drowned. Then, the thermodynamic reality of the Russian winter arrived. The German logistics officers had prioritized artillery shells and fuel over winter clothing. They operated under the arrogant, fatal assumption that the Red Army would collapse in 6 weeks. The biological hardware of the German infantry was left exposed to 30 degrees below zero. The system failure was absolute. The synthetic rubber used for German vehicle tires shattered in the sub-zero temperatures. Machine gun oil froze solid, rendering the weapons completely useless. The glass optics on the anti-tank guns frosted over. Tank crews had to light open fires underneath the engine blocks of their panzers just to thaw the oil enough to start the engines in the morning. Men lost their fingers and toes to frostbite by the tens of thousands. The High Command panicked. They authorized massive shipments of Pervitin to the Eastern Front, hoping to chemically stimulate the freezing soldiers into one final, desperate push toward Moscow. You cannot hack a freezing human body with methamphetamine when the core temperature drops below fatal parameters. The drug simply masked the sensation of freezing to death. The greatest military machine in Europe was permanently paralyzed in the snow. The physical dimensions of a train track, the friction of the dirt, and the unforgiving math of winter completely broke the system. By the spring of 1942, the German High Command thawed out their surviving hardware and somehow convinced themselves the winter freeze was just a fluke. They looked at the maps, ignored the catastrophic attrition rates, and launched another massive summer offensive. Case Blue. The strategic reality had completely shifted. Look at the balance sheets. The Wehrmacht was bankrupt of petroleum. Germany had practically zero domestic oil reserves, and their synthetic fuel plants couldn't possibly match the daily burn rate of a mechanized continental war. They were running on fumes. Case Blue was a desperate, massive armed robbery aimed directly at the oil fields of the Caucasus. If they didn't capture those refineries, the entire armored spearhead would permanently park itself by autumn. Then the dictator got distracted by a vanity project, Stalingrad. From a purely systems engineering perspective, driving a panzer division into a major industrial city is an act of tactical insanity. The entire concept of blitzkrieg is built on avoiding strong points. You bypass the urban centers, sever the rail lines, and let the defenders starve in isolation. Hitler became obsessed with the psychological victory of taking the city named after his rival. The generals simply obliged him. The Luftwaffe arrived first. They saturated the city with incendiary and high explosive bombs, turning the industrial center into a burning wasteland. They assumed they were softening the target and clearing the path for the infantry. They actually built the perfect fortress for the Soviet defenders. A mechanized army requires flat ground. A tank cannot drive over a two-story pile of shattered concrete and twisted steel rebar. The rubble acted as an impenetrable anti-tank barrier. The mobility died. The radios became useless inside the steel-reinforced concrete shells of the factories. The kinetic paralysis that had shattered the French army completely dissolved. The conflict devolved into what the German infantry called the Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. This was the complete negation of modern tactical doctrine. It was a subterranean nightmare fought in sewers and shattered basements using sharpened entrenching tools and flamethrowers. Front lines weren't measured in miles, they were measured in floorboards. The Germans would capture the first floor of an apartment building. The Soviets would hold the second. They shot at each other through holes in the ceiling. Soldiers fought for 3 weeks over a single ruined kitchen. The technological advantage of the German war machine was entirely nullified by spatial geometry. While the Germans bled their elite infantry dry in the rubble, the Soviet industrial math silently calculated their destruction. Remember those 1,500 factories the Soviets unbolted and shipped past the Ural Mountains? By late 1942, they were running at full capacity. The Soviet system completely stripped the concept of luxury out of tank production. A German Panzer was an over-engineered masterpiece. The tolerances were perfect. The optics were flawless. It required highly specialized mechanics to maintain. The Soviet T-34 was built by women and teenagers in freezing factories. The welds were incredibly ugly. The seats were brutal. But the gun worked. The sloped armor was incredibly thick, and they could build 10 of them in the time it took Germany to build 1 Panzer. The Soviet command realized the average lifespan of a tank on the Eastern Front was roughly 6 months. They didn't bother engineering parts to last a year. They built a machine explicitly designed for a disposable war. The Red Army watched the Germans throw their best units into the meat grinder. They waited. They massed over 1 million men and nearly 1,000 of those ugly, flawless T-34s in the frozen steppes north and south of the city. Operation Uranus. Soviet intelligence officers noticed a massive structural flaw in the German lines. Because the Wehrmacht concentrated all their heavy armor and elite troops inside the city, they protected their massive, exposed flanks with Allied armies. Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian conscripts. These soldiers were poorly equipped, lacked heavy anti-tank weapons, and had absolutely zero desire to freeze to death for a foreign dictator. When the Soviet artillery opened up in November, the flanks completely disintegrated. The pincer jaws snapped shut in days. 300,000 German soldiers were suddenly trapped inside the frozen rubble of their own vanity project. This is where the bureaucratic delusion reached its absolute peak. Hermann Göring casually promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply the trapped 6th Army entirely by air. He claimed his planes could drop 500 tons of food, fuel, and ammunition every single day. The logistics officers looked at the cargo capacity of their Junkers Ju-52 transport planes. They looked at the brutal Russian winter weather reports. The math was impossible. They begged the high command to let the 6th Army break out before the Soviet lines solidified. Hitler refused. He ordered them to stand fast. The planes never really came. The weather grounded them. Soviet anti-aircraft batteries shredded the ones that managed to take off. The 6th Army needed an absolute minimum of 300 tons a day just to survive. On a good day, they received maybe 50 tons. Most days, they got absolutely nothing. And because the supply chain was in total administrative collapse, the planes that did land often carried the wrong cargo. Starving, freezing soldiers opened transport crates expecting bread and winter coats, only to find thousands of right-footed boots, black pepper, and millions of condoms. The biological reality of starvation in sub-zero temperatures is horrifying. The human body starts consuming its own muscle tissue. The German soldiers ate the remaining draft horses. Then they ate the stray dogs. Then they boiled leather belts to chew on the hide. By January 1943, they were freezing to death by the thousands in the basements of a ruined tractor factory. The unstoppable, meth-fueled machine of 1940 was dead. It had been ground into dust by industrial mathematics and the unforgiving Russian winter. By early 1944, the math was irreversible. The strategic initiative was permanently dead. The German war machine was operating as a massive demolition project in reverse, slowly collapsing back toward its own capital. Pop history loves to fixate on Albert Speer's so-called armaments miracle during this period. The data does show a massive spike in production in 1944. German factories churned out more heavy Tiger and Panther tanks and more Focke-Wulf fighter planes than at any previous point in the war. The propaganda ministry touted this as undeniable proof of ultimate victory. The numbers were a complete illusion. Speer cannibalized the civilian economy, stripped safety standards to zero, and relied entirely on the mass starvation of millions of slave laborers. Building 10,000 beautifully engineered airplanes is completely irrelevant if you don't have high-octane aviation fuel. You just built 10,000 very expensive aluminum coffins. The Allied bomber offensive had systematically deleted the German synthetic oil refineries. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was effectively grounded. The pristine new Panzers rolling off the assembly lines were paralyzed. The military literally could not spare the diesel to let them drive to the front. They were loaded onto trains. This introduces the final, fatal systemic failure, the Deutsche Reichsbahn. The National Railway was the central nervous system of the entire German war effort. Coal had to move from the Ruhr to the steel mills. Steel had to move to the tank factories. The tanks had to move to the Eastern Front. In the autumn of 1944, the Allies stopped carpet bombing city centers and started systematically targeting the rail marshalling yards. The transportation network completely shattered. Coal couldn't reach the factories. Munitions couldn't reach the troops. Those brand new Panther tanks sat motionless on shattered rail cars in the middle of Germany, acting as static pillboxes, waiting to be blown up by Allied fighter bombers. The surviving armor was entirely stripped of its mobility. Pristine Tiger tanks were towed to defensive lines by conscripted agricultural tractors. They were permanently reduced to static steel bunkers because they mathematically lacked the diesel to drive themselves. This specific logistical collapse reveals the terminal sickness of the Nazi state. A rational military apparatus facing total physical destruction would dedicate every remaining ounce of coal and rolling stock to national defense. The Third Reich did the exact opposite. Their ideological madness completely superseded basic military survival. Even as frontline panzer divisions begged for diesel and artillery shells, the Reichsbahn administrators actively prioritized train schedules to transport millions of Jewish people and other targeted groups to the extermination camps in the East. The bureaucracy dedicated its most precious, rapidly shrinking resource to industrial genocide. It is the darkest, most absolute proof that the machine was not just broken, it was fundamentally psychotic. The demographic ledger was completely bankrupt. The regime had burned through its prime biological workforce in the freezing mud of Russia and the hedgerows of Normandy. The bureaucracy simply lowered the acceptable parameters of a human soldier. The Volkssturm, the People's Storm. The newsreels tried to paint it as a heroic, spontaneous national uprising. Look at the logistics. It was child abuse on an industrial scale. The state pulled 14-year-old boys out of the Hitler Youth, handed them a disposable anti-tank pipe, and ordered them to stop a Soviet armored brigade. They drafted 60-year-old grandfathers from the postal service. The industrial system was so broken, they couldn't even issue real weapons anymore. They stamped out the Volkssturmgewehr, a crude, desperately ugly rifle made of cheap sheet metal and scrap wood. It jammed constantly. The state only expected the user to survive for a few hours anyway. The physical war ended in May 1945. The bureaucratic war to rewrite history started almost immediately. When the guns finally stopped, the surviving architects of the German war machine found themselves sitting in Allied prisoner-of-war camps. These were the aristocratic Prussian generals, the logistics officers, the quartermasters who had calculated the burn rates, authorized the Pervitin, and knowingly sent millions of men to freeze in the Russian mud. They were staring down the very real prospect of the hangman's noose at the upcoming Nuremberg trials. They desperately needed an alibi. So they invented one of the most successful, enduring historical fabrications of the 20th century: the myth of the clean Wehrmacht. The strategy was brilliant in its cynical simplicity. The generals collectively decided to blame absolutely every failure, atrocity, and logistical nightmare on two things: the SS and the dead dictator. They painted a picture of a noble, apolitical professional army that was just doing its duty, completely insulated from the ideological horrors of the Nazi state. They claimed they were brilliant, flawless tacticians who were constantly undermined by Hitler's amateur meddling. If the dictator had just listened to them, they argued, they would have easily taken Moscow and won the war. It was a complete statistical fabrication. We already looked at the supply logs. We know the trains didn't fit the Russian tracks. We know the quartermasters prioritized ammunition over winter coats. We know the panzer divisions were running out of artillery shells and relying on starving horses weeks before Hitler ever intervened in the strategic planning of Operation Barbarossa. The machine was fundamentally broken at the administrative level, but the dead cannot testify. Hitler made the perfect scapegoat for the general's own staggering incompetence. Then the Cold War started, and the geopolitical math completely changed. By the late 1940s, the United States and Britain were looking at the massive, mechanized Soviet army occupying half of Europe. The Western Allies suddenly realized they needed a rearmed West Germany to act as a physical buffer state against the communists. You cannot convince the American or British public to ally with the exact same generals they just spent 4 years fighting unless you sanitize their resumes. The United States Army essentially hired the German High Command to write their own history. They established a facility in Germany called Camp King. The U.S. Army Historical Division brought in Franz Halder, the exact same chief of the General Staff who catastrophically miscalculated the size of the Red Army and ignored the winter logistics. They gave Halder a staff, a comfortable office, and unparalleled editorial control. He formed a control group tasked with reviewing and censoring the memoirs and historical accounts of hundreds of captured German officers. Halder operated like an academic mob boss. He literally spent the next decade grading his own performance review on the American taxpayer's dime. Any German officer who submitted a report criticizing the High Command's logistics or detailing the regular army's deep, systemic complicity in war crimes on the Eastern Front had their work quietly suppressed or entirely rewritten. Halder elevated the accounts that praised the genius of Blitzkrieg and blamed the weather or Hitler for the defeat. The Americans published these sanitized reports as official, objective military history. Halder was eventually awarded the Meritorious Civilian Service Award by the United States government. The architect of the greatest logistical failure in modern warfare received a medal for explaining how it wasn't his fault. Heinz Guderian executed the exact same public relations strategy in the civilian sector. He published his massive memoir, Panzer Leader, cementing himself in the public consciousness as the infallible godfather of mechanized warfare. He conveniently omitted his gross insubordination, the massive Ardennes traffic jams, the crippling mechanical breakdown rates of his tanks, and the fact that his troops were artificially fueled by crystal meth. This is exactly where the pop history you see on television comes from. For decades, Western historians didn't have access to the locked Soviet archives. They had to rely entirely on the memoirs written by the German generals who survived. We swallowed the propaganda of the vanquished because it was politically convenient for the Cold War. We bought the myth of the perfectly engineered, unstoppable machine. We fetishized the Tiger tank while ignoring the shattered transmissions. We marveled at the speed of the French invasion while ignoring the psychotic brakes of the soldiers driving the trucks. We focused entirely on the kinetic strategy because looking at the underlying systems, the drug addiction, the resource bankruptcy, the bureaucratic arrogance, and the industrial-scale child abuse of the Volkssturm is deeply uncomfortable. The Third Reich built a chaotic, fragile, chemically dependent engine powered by stolen capital. It was mathematically doomed the moment it crossed the border into a country with a superior industrial base. The actual ledger of the German war machine is measured in the tens of millions of human beings who were fed into an unsustainable, bureaucratic meat grinder. They died to prop up the ego of a regime that knew it was mathematically bankrupt of fuel by 1942. That is the unvarnished reality of the machine. The rest is just a ghost story written by the men who crashed it. 80 years later, the physical remnants of that machine are quietly being erased by the earth. All that frantic kinetic energy, the deafening noise of the factories, and the arrogant bureaucratic math have been reduced to absolute silence. Nature is systematically dismantling what is left. The massive concrete submarine pens on the French coast are slowly fracturing, slipping inch by inch into the Atlantic Ocean. The thousands of miles of train tracks that carried so much suffering are buried under layers of dirt and overgrown with heavy forest. The shattered hulls of the panzer divisions that once tore across the steppe have completely oxidized. They are just hollow, rusted shells sitting quietly under the snow in Eastern Europe. History eventually buries every machine. The fuel runs out, the engines seize, and the earth quietly reclaims the steel. There is a deep comfort in that permanence. The past is entirely fixed. The ledgers are closed. The crisis is over. There is nothing left to calculate. There is nothing left to manage. Let the quiet of the present replace the noise of history. It is time to power down your own engine. Close your eyes. Let go of the timeline and rest.